In this SBM video tutorial, we will cover how to establish dependencies between relational fields across multiple tables. The reason you may want to do this is if you have a relational field pointing to items in a table and you wish to limit the number of items that show up in said relational field by selecting an item or value that is associated with each item within that table. The example we'll use for this tutorial will involve the use of 3 tables within the same process app, 1 primary table and 2 auxiliary tables. Here's a graphic to visually explain the general layout of the example we'll be using in this tutorial. Let's say I have a collection of items in this auxiliary table here with a single relational field in the primary table pointing to it. If I want to limit the available selections in this relational field dependent upon a selection I make in another field, those selections need to come from another single relational field in the same table that points to another table that contains those independent items or values that are made in the form of items. Then the items in the original auxiliary table need to be associated with the items from this independent driving auxiliary table. To better explain how this works, I will put it in the context of a simple problem. As a disclaimer, the following scenario would likely not necessitate creating dependencies and relationships between multiple tables, which I'll explain later on. But I will use this example for demonstrative purposes to explain the logic and how it works. It should be noted that relational dependencies can be established between any number of tables, including those that span across multiple applications. Let's say I have a process app with an auxiliary table containing an extensive list of food items. The list can be so long that it might make it difficult for me to find the selection I want in the relational field that points to this table. In order to make things more manageable, I've decided to go ahead and categorize my food items. To do this, I need to go ahead and put my categories in a different table, since dependencies on single relational fields require another single relational field. So you can see here that I have my food item single relational field dependent upon the relational field where I will select my category. And so in this table, newly created table called food category, I have each category represented by a separate item. Once this is completed, I will need to have a relational field in my food items table set for every single item in there. So if I have, for example, the item noodles, I need to go ahead and for that item select grains in the relational field pointing to food category. I mentioned before that multiple tables, certainly more than 3, can be used in this kind of a design. If you have a cascade of different tables, one dependent upon the other, the key thing to know here is that the relational fields need to point upstream to the table that dictates the selections of it. So in other words, the dependent tables need to have a relational field point towards the independent tables before it. And the same thing applies to the relational fields that you'll actually be controlling in the primary table. The dependent relational fields need to point to the driving independent relational fields. Now let's take a look at the design of this process app in Composer. As you can see on the left, here are my 3 tables: the primary table, the food category auxiliary table, and the food item auxiliary table. In the primary table, I have my 2 single relational fields pointing to each one of my auxiliary tables. At this time, I want to remind you that the relationships and dependencies don't need to involve auxiliary tables. They could be with primary tables from a referenced application. They could be between just auxiliary tables. Any tables, it doesn't matter. This is just the setup that I'm using for this example. Now I have my 2 relational fields, and then for the food category table, there is no relational fields in here because it is the independent driving table. And then my food item table, which is the dependent table that relies upon the selection made for food category. And that's why I have the single relational field here, food category, pointed to that food category table. So this is where I would have my different food items such as noodles, as I mentioned earlier, which would be the title of one of them. And for that one, I would go ahead and set grains in the food category single relational field because grains would be a actual item in the food category table. To go ahead and show you the values I imported into these tables just to make sure I explain these things accurately. I will show you the food category table first. You can see these are all the different items I have in there representing my categories. They're all independent. And then my food item table will contain all my different foods. And this is the single relational field food category that's pointing up to the food category table. And you can see the association I made for each food item is appropriate. So once this is configured, you'll need to go ahead and then establish the dependency between the two single relational fields in the primary table. You go ahead and select the independent driving one, which is food category. Go to the dependencies in the property editor, and then select the dependent fields. And this is already selected because I've already configured this earlier. On the right side, you go to Edit Value Restrictions and select the appropriate workflow that this applies to. You select the independent field here, the field that you want to restrict the selections on, and then the column in which you want to match to complete that dependency. Down here you can actually, this is a nifty feature, once you make the selection in the food category selection field, if you want to immediately see like the first valid food item, such as if you were to select grains for category, and the first thing you want to see is the first grain related item show up in the food item selection field, you can select first valid entry. So instead of leaving it to whatever the default value is, in my case none, if I had this selected and I selected grains in the food category, it would instantly populate with whatever my first food item is for that category in alphabetical order. So once you have everything set up as I have outlined here, and also assuming that all your data is properly set up, such as like in the food item table, I needed to actually set a food category for each one of my items. And if this is some new setup where you're trying to go ahead and establish a new relationship to items in another table, you might need to go ahead and utilize mass update or data import to go ahead and start assigning values for like these relational fields in these tables. And you can consult our documentation for more information on those. So once this is deployed, you can go ahead and start playing with the dependencies on the whatever transition form these fields are included on. In my case, it'll be the submit form. You can go ahead and then select an item from your independent field food category and select grains. And as you can see there from that feature I mentioned earlier, the first available selection that satisfies the dependency is automatically shown there and dropped into the field. I can select a different one there, and I select dairy. I got cheeses in my cheese and milk are my selections there. So everything is working. So there is a basic overview of how to use dependencies through relational fields and multiple tables. I mentioned earlier that this may not make the best sense in this particular application where you just have food categories needing to go ahead and limit your selections for food items. And the reason is because if it's just one value here, such as a category, it would make better sense to go ahead and add a single selection field in the food items table and then put all your values in that selection field for your categories. And then to ease in making your selection for the food item relational field pointing to it, you can use what's called the relational field value lookup, which I will explain in another video tutorial. An example of a more practical application for this is if you had something like purchase orders loaded in one auxiliary table and invoices in the other. Each one are independent of each other with an own set of fields, but they do need to have a relationship established between them because every purchase order will be followed with an invoice later on. So consider the different problems that you may have in your application and organization and consider what solutions are right for you. Again, consult my other video tutorial on the relational value lookup to see if that is something that is more suitable to your application.